see her in Iran. And it's just a great personal cost. But she's been a longtime activist and has been detained, pressured, and sentenced for her activism many times, and currently also is serving a prison sentence.
And so she has fought for women's rights. She's also campaigned for the abolition of the death penalty and improvement of prison conditions. When is she expected to be out? And what kind of pressure do you think this puts on the Iranian regime?
Well, this will be essentially a two-edged sword. First, it would generate anger from the hardliners in Iran, the Iranian regime, that essentially more and more attention is given to someone that they have been trying to portray as someone who is threatening national security and has been essentially arrested for these security charges as they bring against these activists. But then at the same time, I think it will generate global solidarity, it would generate sympathy, and it would raise the cost for keeping someone so high profile in prison, continuing to detain them, because the attempt is try to silence people and try to sentence and pressure them in the dark without much attention. And this essentially prize will bring even more attention, I would say more power to Nargis and her activism and other activists currently serving prisons in Iran. And hopefully at the end of the day, it will empower her and help her with this kind of global attention and solidarity that it will bring.
This comes 20 years after Shireen Ebadi, the women's rights activist in Iran, was also awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Do you feel there's been progress, Nagar?
Well, I think if we look at it, essentially looking at the long arc of history in a linear line, there has been. The Iranian society has changed a lot. I mean, just looking at the protests of the past year, women and young girls really risking a lot. It comes at a deadly price for many of these protesters and activists. But I also think what we're seeing, for example, the transformation of the Iranian public space when it comes to the issue of hijab, which is also something that Nargis has been opposing, the mandatory hijab laws. We've seen tremendous change and transformation in Iranian public space. I speak to sources, friends, journalists, activists inside Iran, and there are just so many women and girls right now courageously defying the mandatory hijab, this one discriminatory law against women, essentially gaining their bodily autonomy after the death of Mahsa Amini with the spark of that mass protest. So I think overall, there has been steps backwards, steps forward, but in general, the women's rights and the various rights movement have been pushing forward and making progress in pushing the state back and demanding more rights.
Well, I want to thank you, Nagar Mortazavi, for being with us to talk about this year's Nobel Peace Prize going to Nargis Mohammadi, the Iranian human rights activist who is currently in prison. Nagar is an Iranian-American journalist, host of the Iran podcast, and senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Coming up, we speak to the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnston on Donald Trump's civil fraud trial, on why this may mean more to Trump than any others of the trials, as the judge could be leading to the dismembering of Donald Trump's financial empire. Stay with us. دلتی سبز زاره گلای آبی داره صبح از برگ گلاش شبنم میباره توی چشات یه رده رنگین کمونی داره یه پل به یه آسمونی داره لالا شب پره شب تا صبح میخونه دلم تا ابد پیش تو میمونه لالا شب پره. Music by the Iranian musician Marjan Farsad. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to Donald Trump's civil fraud trial here in New York, Trump's attorneys are expected to file a motion today to stay the trial pending an appeal of a judge's ruling last week that Trump and his two eldest sons, Eric and Donald Jr., had committed fraud by vastly overstating the assets of their company. The pretrial ruling puts the future of the Trump Organization's real estate empire in jeopardy. Trump voluntarily attended the first 3 days of the trial. During comments to the press, he repeatedly attacked New York's Attorney General Letitia James for bringing the fraud case against him. On Monday, Trump assailed James, who is African-American, as a racist and called the trial judge, Arthur Engoron, a disgrace. On Wednesday, James denounced Trump's comments.
What they were comments that unfortunately fomented violence, and comments that I would describe as race baiting, and comments, unfortunately, that appeals to the bottom of our humanity. I will not be bullied. And so Mr. Trump is no longer here. The Donald Trump show is over. This was nothing more than a political stunt, a fundraising stop.
On Tuesday, Judge Engoron placed a gag order on Donald Trump, the first on a former president, after he falsely claimed on social media that the judge's law clerk was the girlfriend of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. The judge barred Trump from posting, sending emails, or making public remarks about members of the judge's staff. To talk more about the opening week of the trial, we're joined by David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter who's reported on Trump for decades. He's the author of 3 books on Trump, including The Big Cheat, How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. Johnston is also a distinguished visiting lecturer at Syracuse University College of Law. David, it's great to have you back with us. If you can start off by talking about the significance of this trial for Donald Trump. I mean, this is a civil trial. He didn't have to show up, though he falsely alleged he was being forced off the campaign trail to show up for this trial.
Well, unlike the 4 separate criminal indictments where Donald is at risk of incarceration, going to jail, this is a civil trial. But Donald Trump is his money. That's the most important thing to understand about Donald. And, of course, his money is always being inflated along with other things. You know, he claims buildings are bigger than they are. He claims more money. And in this case, the judge has already ruled that Donald committed repeated, calculated frauds. The issue in this trial, the principal issue in this trial, there's some minor facts, is how much must he disgorge because his frauds resulted in ill-got gains that he must give up.
So talk about why this is so important to me. Another civil trial, right, the sexual assault trial of E. Jean Carroll, he did not show up for.
Well, that's right. And E. Jean Carroll similarly got a judge to rule there was such overwhelming evidence there was no need to try the merits of the case. Donald Trump is a rapist. That's been established by another judge. He already owes $5 million to the writer E. Jean Carroll, and now there's a second defamation case that she's brought, and there will be a trial only to determine again how much money he owes. In this trial, before Judge Engoron, Donald has had all of his business licenses revoked. The Trump Organization, his eyes wide open, blind trust he created when he became president, and the at least 500 Trump legal entities, mostly limited liability companies, no longer have business licenses, and you cannot do business without a business license. The judge has appointed another judge, a retired judge, as a monitor to make sure that Trump and his sons and the 2 executives who are in the case don't abscond with any of the money until it's determined how much is there. Ultimately, we will see the Trump Organization, his umbrella group, turned over to a receiver. This is similar to bankruptcy when you dissolve a company, but it's under New York State business law. It's not a bankruptcy case. His properties will be sold. Creditors and the government will get paid first. And if there's any money left at the end of the day, Amy, it will go to Donald Trump.
So you're talking about properties. That's Donald Trump's residence in the Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. That's one of the buildings. Is that right, David K. Johnston? One of the ones that also he, to say the least, inflated from 10,000 feet to 30,000 feet, and why that matters, square feet.
Well, he claimed the building was 3 times the size it was so he could justify an enormously higher value than it's worth. And Donald does this all the time. Trump Tower is 58 stories. He'll tell you it's 68 stories. He owns a mansion on a large wooded area in Westchester County, about a short drive from Manhattan. He's claimed it's worth as much as $291 million. The most generous appraisal was $30 million, roughly a tenth of that, and it was based on the idea that he could carve it up into smaller estates and sell them off, and the local authorities have said, no, we're not going to allow you to carve it up. So the property's more likely worth something in the order of, say, $10 million, and Donald's claims are 29 times that much, Amy.
So Samuel Bankman-Fried is on trial right nearby here in New York. He was jailed before the trial for violating a gag order. President Trump has just had a gag order imposed because, among other things, of what he just tweeted out in the midst of the trial, that the clerk, who was sitting just feet from him right next to the judge, was having an affair with Chuck Schumer. Can you talk about the significance of what it would mean if the judge found him guilty of violating that gag order? Could he end up in the same position as Samuel Bankman-Fried?
He absolutely could end up remanded to jail. Donald is, I believe, for political reasons, trying to provoke one of the judges in his criminal or this civil case to send him to jail so that he can rally his supporters and say, see, the system is rigged. They're out to get me. I didn't do anything wrong, but they're going to shut me up. He threatened General Milley, who just retired as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's not going to result in being remanded to custody because General Milley, who was a valorous infantryman in combat, is not being intimidated by Donald.
I mean, he essentially said that Milley should be executed.
Absolutely. He said he should be executed. The judge's secretary, however, or clerk, the judge's clerk, has nothing to do with the merits of the proceedings. And the judge made it clear that you write or say anything about any person on my staff, and there will be consequences. And I think he's made it pretty clear that Trump might get one more chance. But if he does it twice, I assure you, then he's going to be remanded by this judge.
And for people to understand how a decision has been made in parts of this trial, I mean, it is a bench juror. It's a bench trial. It doesn't go to a jury. Oh, and also President Trump lied when he said he had wanted a jury trial because his lawyers never asked for one.
Right. Well, Donald, I'm confident, based on his public remarks, would be very concerned that a New York City jury, a Manhattan jury, could be very bad for him. They might rule very heavily against him. So his lawyers accepted a bench trial, whether they did it by incompetence or intentionally. They agreed to this. So there's no question about that. He's been denied nothing by the judge. And the facts in this case are so overwhelming that Letitia James put before the court, showing that again and again and again, every time the Trumps valued a property, they overvalued it. If there'd been a mixed bag, now and then they overvalued things. Most of the time they were reasonable. That would be different. And, Amy, imagine you own a $300,000 house. Well, maybe it's worth $270,000. Maybe it's worth $330,000. But if you go to a bank and say, loan me money, this house is worth $3 million or $30 million, that's just fraud. So all this trial is about, or primarily what this trial is about, is how much in damages does Donald Trump own for his and his son's years of fraud?
So, David K. Johnston, you have written several books on Donald Trump. Is this case more important to them? He also fell off the, Forbes billionaire list than any of the other ones.
Well, it's more important to Donald's mind because he grew up in a household with a father who was just a complete monster, who taught him and his other children that all that matters is getting the money. As long as you don't get arrested, do whatever you need to do. There are no rules. You're special. The rules of law, the rules of decency, they don't apply to you. And so to Donald, in his psyche, this is much more important. But The fact is that in the other cases, particularly the effort to overthrow the United States government on January 6th, he faces prison if convicted. But